Hi everybody, I'm so happy to be back with you today. Today I'm going to go a little bit more into my story and kind of share what it's like to grow up in a very toxic, abusive family with a psychopathic, narcissistic mother. So if you're watching this and you feel like you may be triggered, please get your grounding and safe space kind of set up. So I've got lots of pillows with me. I've got my life therapy grounded candle and some notes this time to help me out, kind of guide me along the way. So I remember when I was younger, I read this book and it was called A Child Called It. And I didn't understand at the time why I kept reading this book over and over and over again. But it was because in reading that book, I was reading my own story. In the book, it tells the story of how Dave, who is the author, is treated different from his other siblings. He is made to sleep in the basement. He is beat. He is neglected, wears clothes that are not washed and often too small, is forced to do some really kind of horrific things, including eating fecal matter and drinking out of a toilet. And so to grow up in a household like this is to know, first and foremost, that you are not safe ever. It is to know a life that is constantly on eggshells. It is to know that if anything in the house goes wrong with any person, that not only will you be blamed, you will be punished, and the punishment will always be way more severe than what the crime or the perceived crime is. It is to know that nothing is constant, that promises don't matter. It is to understand that on top of never being safe, that you never have security, that you will never sleep safely. Many attacks that narcissists do come at night. It's a way that they maintain control, actually, is because when you are sleep deprived, you are unable to properly think or function, and they use that to their advantage. And that is something that my mother did my entire life. It is to understand that no part of your life belongs to you. This is something that on some level I understood, but I didn't gain complete freedom, frankly, until just a few years ago from this, because I kept waiting and I kept expecting not just for truth to come out, but for the people who had spent all of these years and decades abusing me to finally see me and to admit it, for there to be an apology, and none of that ever comes. One, because narcissists and psychopaths, they just do not feel empathy. They're not compassionate. They can act that way and behave that way. And they often have public fronts that lead people to believe that they are. So Polly, the woman who gave birth to me, she works in the medical field. Ironically enough, she is considered a mental health specialist. She even owned her own clinic at one time. She was considered a specialist in the field of PTSD, which is ironic. And was highly regarded in many ways. She started off as a nurse on the mental health unit. And so it's interesting to look at my childhood and all the signs that I showed of having some pretty significant things that a professional in mental health should have addressed, right, if they were really doing their job properly. But not only did she not address it, she is the one who inflicted all of these things that created it. And it's the same way with my siblings, actually. So I've got a sibling who is a firefighter, obviously, right? Heroic, very respectable looking career. Another who is a business executive, another career that looks very, just outstanding. And then someone who's a child care provider. And again, it's kind of like all of these fronts, and none of it is real. It's just the projections that they give out into the world for how they want to be seen. It's really sad, to be honest with you, in many ways, obviously, right? Because when you live a life, that's a little better. When you live a life that is just a constant set of lies, it's not just that you're lying to the world, it's that you spend your life lying to yourself as well. And one thing about a narcissist is that they will never admit anything. I've had a couple of really, I call them God moments, where things have been said to me and been admitted to me that was just, blew me away, because it is not the nature of narcissists or of toxic people to do this, to take any accountability whatsoever for any actions that they have ever done in their lifetime. And there is a language of narcissism in households, something I didn't understand until after I was 40 years old. So I'm what they call a scapegoat. And the term scapegoat actually comes from the Bible. But in terms of mental health and in terms of narcissism and toxicity, the scapegoat is the person in the family where everything is blamed and heaped on. Often the scapegoat is called the black sheep. It is the person in the family who will not adhere to the rules of living lies and to covering up and to being beholden by secrets or continuing patterns of abuse. And I was that person. From childhood, very, very young, actually. I didn't find this out until I started researching myself. Narcissists are pathological liars, and you'll see that in the patterns of not just Polly, but my ex, the father of my oldest son, both of my sisters, and then to some extent my brother. But the truth is, I don't really know my brother. We've never had a close relationship. We've never spent a lot of time together. And that can actually be said of all of my family. As I'll share with you, I moved a lot. I knew I had to get away. I just didn't understand that I had to stay away. When I became pregnant at 24, I thought very wrongly that this was like the path to healing and reconciliation in my family, because I thought for sure once I had a child, right, things would be different, and it wasn't. And it ended up being just horrific for my children. It still is. They betrayed my children in the same way they betrayed me. They side with my ex, who is equally abusive as they are. And so 2.5 years ago, life changed for my husband and I in like a huge, huge way. I am such a believer that truth always comes out, and it's hardly ever in our timing, right? And when we want it done. But about 2.5 years ago, a lot of things finally started coming out, and that included the abuses of my ex to my children. And then that my oldest niece, who I was very close to, that her life was beginning to spiral out of control, that in her family, she was the scapegoat. Everything was blamed on her. She had had a child and was really struggling. Her mom betrayed her after she had her child. Her mom had betrayed her entire life. Even with the abuses that my siblings endured, they kept sending their children to my mom, where they would be abused on every occasion. But my oldest niece came to myself and my husband and began telling us just really how terrible things were, and that she knew that her parents were not capable of loving, and that she was falling apart. She had become very entwined with a significantly older gentleman that led down a few very dark paths for her. And this is also when I began finding out that my oldest son had replicated some abuses that he had endured by his father upon my middle son. So I was in a lot of shock and overwhelm at this time. And at this time, my niece also came to my husband and I and began telling us that she was having incestuous thoughts. She had a child at this point. It was very scary. And she started telling us just how in danger her life and therefore the life of her child had become. And for me, it was terrifying because my family was very incestuous. My youngest sibling had sex with me. I walked in on my oldest sibling orally copulating my middle sibling. My mom was very actively engaged in this. This was like a huge secret in our family. I was constantly molested by family members for my entire life, a few who I've confronted. But I was also groomed for that, as I've shared in a previous video. So my mom prostituted us. But when my mom got married the second time, so we were living in West Virginia, and she and Julian got separated and eventually divorced. And if you listen to the story that my mom tells, it's that he left and wanted nothing to do with us. And my mom at that time was not educated. She hadn't even finished her high school education. But the truth is that she had taken us and hidden us, her children, from Julian, because for her and for every narcissist that's alive, their lives are driven by control. They want to control everything, which is why I had no control over almost any aspect of my life for almost my entire life. So first she moved us to a family who lived where we lived in West Virginia, while she went to Kentucky to begin what she said was her education. Then we went to live with, to me, they were unknown family members, where we didn't really understand what was going on. Maybe my oldest sibling did, I'm not sure, but I certainly didn't. And we wouldn't frequently see my mom. And when we would, if we cried, we would be punished. But another thing that's very common with narcissists is that they are never faithful. They are serial cheaters. And my mother in particular, she always went for married men, always. And my mom is also, she also uses religion as a form of abuse, which I'll get into in a little bit. So when she went back up for what she said was her education, she had been having an affair with a married man who, by all accounts from her anyway, was going to leave his wife, and he was a wealthy doctor and everything was going to be different. And once she moved, this proved not to be true. And I would again find this out when I was researching myself, because I knew my entire life that Julian was not my father. I knew I was different. I knew everything about me really was different. I knew that he wasn't my father. It would be denied, and then the truth would all come out. But again, it wasn't until after I was 40. And even having proof, scientific proof, she still denies that to this day. She just will not take any responsibility or accountability. But back to my childhood. So we moved from, people that she knew in West Virginia to family that I didn't know at the time in Kentucky. And then we moved into a home in Burlington, Kentucky. And this is where we were being watched by Pentecostal going people, and went to a church that was terrifying. And it was in that church that, I began yet another round, I guess, of being molested by God-fearing people and everything. And I would find out many, many years later that my middle sibling was also being molested at that time by a female named Stacy. I don't remember Stacy, to be honest with you. My mom was gone all the time. My sister is 4 years older than me. She became kind of the caretaker, if you will, just really without a choice. But we were alone a lot. My mom wasn't there. We weren't safe. We weren't protected. So all of these patterns continued and went very unchecked. And I'll tell you at this time that my abuse has always been very apparent. I was already like gross, neglected, like stinky kid. If you look at pictures of me, my hair was like all matted, like never brushed, never anything. I was still wetting the bed at this time. I would stink of pee, my clothes were too small. But I began getting like vaginal yeast infections, which is just not normal. And Polly knew this, and she would make me feel like disgusting because of it, even though she knew that it was because I was being molested. I still sucked my thumb at this time, and this was in first grade. Another thing happened at this time that was like a huge deal to me though, and that was that I ran my first race. We had like a track day, and I was wearing shoes that were too small. I didn't have socks on, but it was one thing that Polly showed up at. So it was like a big deal to me. And I won first place, and like she was excited and she was there. And so I learned the importance of performance at that time, that if I'm doing something that sheds a positive light on her and where she's getting positive attention because of what I'm accomplishing, then that is a good thing. And so at a very young age, I understood the importance of performance. And it was also at this time where that very wealthy married man kind of stepped out and her reality began to sink in. And she had met another gentleman who would ultimately become her second husband. He was not a good person. He was not kind. Their family wasn't kind. But he had an uncle. And this uncle's name was Robert. Robert had formerly been a school teacher. His father-in-law and his wife were preachers, ministers maybe, in the United Methodist Church. They were what appeared to be very upright, solid, God-fearing Christians with a great reputation and standing in the community. But Robert was a child molester. He had lost his job as a teacher because of it, but because of the time that happened, he actually received pay and was just very quietly excused from his job. From there, he worked a few jobs, but, at the time that we knew him, he was working in like it was Miami Town Auto Parts, so it was like a junkyard, and just no one thought that was really weird, but it was because he wasn't supposed to be around kids. Now, Polly knew this very well going in, and he had not stopped any of those behaviors. He had an interest in both young girls and young boys. And all of his behaviors continued. To see or to know now what I know, it was very apparent in John's family. There was, John had his own significant problems, and he was very unkind. One of his siblings was with a transgendered person, and at that time in the world it was very unheard of, very taboo. And then another of his siblings was a lifelong drug addict who never left home. So it was very apparent that these abuses had continued, in particular with the male children of that family. And Polly knew, she was very aware, and she just put us into Robert's hands over and over and over. And it started with me, which made sense. Now, what did she get out of this? Because that's the other thing with narcissists, is everything that they do because it benefits them in some way. So what did she get out of it? I don't know to this day. Possibly tuition. She got us kids out of her hair. But she was also having an affair with Robert. She was sexually involved with him. And we would, take these vacations together. I mean, it was just really, really messed up. A lot of things that just never should have been. And they weren't discreet. We would get a room and in a hotel, those two would have their own room and we would, as kids, be alone in our room. Just really not right stuff happening, And narcissists have this thing that they flaunt their secrets. So, even when her second husband wasn't involved, we and Polly would go over to Robert and Lois's house, and it was this big joke to them that they were getting away with these things that they were doing, between each other and then Polly's children, right? And that's a pattern that, again, you'll see not just with Polly, but with my ex and with my siblings. And it's this really twisted part of their reality that they think that they're so much smarter than everyone and better than everyone. And so the way that they flaunt these things is just really disgusting, frankly. So that is such a common thing for all narcissists regarding their children. If you are especially the scapegoat of a narcissistic parent, then nothing is off the table for what can happen to you. I was blamed for everything, accused of terrible things. Like, I learned very, very young in my life that I would never be believed, ever. From a very young age, I was told I was a liar. My story was controlled by Polly and my siblings and my ex and, other people. Because you're groomed by a narcissist, you attract narcissists, and it becomes just like a constant in your life because you live a life of nonstop betrayal. You expect then to become betrayed by everyone. And so for me, I just stayed very hidden from people. Very few people did I let really, truly get to know me. Very few people, knew really hardly anything of my story until just a few years ago when so many things finally started coming out. And I finally got the courage to begin, getting the truth out in order that I might heal. And so to go back to the story of a child called It, the things that narcissistic parents do to the scapegoat child are just horrendous. I've shared a little bit, but my youngest brother died as an infant, and he had meningitis, and it was the cause of his death. But because Polly can't and wouldn't accept responsibility, and I found him dead in his crib, I spent a lifetime being blamed. When I began having children, all boys, she began grooming me to kidnap and take my children, and there were huge ramifications for this. But when I was a child, I, would be forced to do things like I had to eat food that I threw up. I would often not be allowed to eat. My siblings were always given privileges I was never given or allowed to do. I wasn't really allowed to have friends because they had a constant fear that I would speak about the things going on. And so it was a very lonely life, and they create that intentionally because, again, it is a form of control. You stay isolated. But one of the really, I personally think, disgusting things about narcissistic parents is they are often very jealous of their children. Narcissistic parents do not want a better life at all for their children. They groom them and set them up constantly for failure. They, as children, will adultize them, force them into adult situations and force them to act as adults. And then as you get older, they infantilize them, all of which happened with me. They intentionally and constantly undercut their kids. They are afraid that their children will do better than them. This is a huge thing you'll see in my ex. This never stops, by the way. It is how, when you're put it into the mix of the secret keeping. They rule by guilt and shame. And all of this adds up to maintaining this very tight grip on their children for life. And it's why, unless you're willing to call them out and to be different, which for me has meant going non-contact, you just become very stuck because you're trauma bonded, where you feel, what you think is love is really like this really super gross bond that you have because of these tragic incidents over and over again. And then, the children subject their children to the same things so that they are able to keep control of their children, which is what my husband and I have seen with my nieces and nephews over and over and over again, where they don't have really strong friendships or relationships. There's none of them. They are forced into this constant cycle of secrecy. So when my niece began sharing with me about the incestuous thoughts and relationships, we got in touch with her child's father, and he shared with us that there had already been many incestuous relationships that had taken place, and that he, was seeking court protection and such for their child, and that never went through because in the same way, that my siblings learn those actions and behaviors, so too have my nieces and nephews. So this is how, a lot of generational stuff begins to happen. And it is the same story with my ex, where you become so bound by lies and secrets that they just become your life, and there becomes no change at all, in the stories that they tell to make themselves look better. And I mean, you are just completely torn apart by the stories that they tell, like constant smear campaigns. And I've endured this my entire life. And so with my ex, I kept everything in the court system so that everything was documented. It's allowing me to write my book. It's allowed me to share facts with a lot of people. But because he started this, not only when I was pregnant, but immediately after giving birth, like I hadn't healed, he began all of these things also. And I knew that the only protection that I would have was through the transcribed court procedures that happened, because he began changing the story, rewriting history, doing all these things immediately. And so one thing that keeps me talking and making these videos is that until my kids know all of the truth, and the same for my nieces and nephews as much as possible, I won't stop talking. I've got 2 kids who I miss so dearly. Parental alienation is something else that we'll get into, but they do this intentionally, and they do it intentionally so that their word is the only word. They do it because not only do they have no empathy, they are driven in their life by the need to control, by rage. They enjoy hurting people. They're sadistic people. And the only time that you see like a glimmer in their eye is when they know that they are twisting the truth, when they know that they're hurting people. And this has really been the story of my life until about the last 15 or so years. But especially in the last 2.5, going on 3, where truth all finally started snowballing and coming out in my favor. So there are many ways that narcissistic parents sabotage and therefore control their kids. So when I was growing up, one of my siblings was a phenomenal artist. Their artwork was beautiful, won many awards, was highly regarded by, so many people. And that person today has not only no interest in that, but really gave up their interest in life in general. That sibling became loyal not to Polly, which became a huge issue, but my two older siblings became loyal to Robert, which says a lot about how nuanced they are at making kids feel safe, even though these really disgusting things were happening to them and they were being forced to do to each other. And I know for my siblings, one sibling was rewarded with a college education. Polly had some of that herself. Another sibling was, rewarded with a lot of monetary and physical things. But then, the harsh reality is she never learned how to live. She never learned finances. She never learned how to take care of herself. And so she spent her life in constant debt, living off of the government, lying to the government, not taking care of herself. All of us have struggled with substance abuse to some extent, if not full-blown addiction. And it's all hidden in secrets. And so all of their lives are just about like this front that they put onto the world. But then my husband and I, are on the backside where their kids are telling us these stories of incest and, stories of one of my siblings being blackout drunk and, having sex on the bed where their child was laying, not asleep, and then, sending them to Polly to continue the cycles of abuse and then gaslighting them. Like, just none of it changed. But what they do with the interests and desires of the children is just undercut them. They completely tear them down, devalue it. And again, it's all about control. It's how they make sure that they stay very dependent, that they make sure that they, are keeping a very, very tight grip. And it just never ends. And these kids, my siblings, my ex, they have such a strong desire to get the approval of especially the same-sex parent, that there's almost nothing that they won't do in order to do that. And it is just heartbreaking. So that's a little bit more of the story today, a little bit more depth. I'm going to go live, so if you want to follow me at all on social media, you can get in touch with me. It's Amanda J. Cox on Facebook. It's Amanda J. Cox 75 on Instagram, or Victim Impact Statements, an account I just started where clients and other people I've worked with are able to begin sharing their stories. I haven't got much of it going. And we'll be launching my site soon, where if you are looking for help in therapeutic resolution, or if you're looking for consulting for your business or organization, you can go to Amanda J. Cox Heals and learn more about it. Because I'm such a firm believer that everyone has the right and is entitled to get healthy. The model that I'll be following is pay what you can, and if you can't pay, then that's okay. But where people can also sponsor that help and care for others. So I'll be announcing that, and I'll be back on a video here within a couple days and more consistent in sharing with you guys. Thanks so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.